the virgin bride who arrived with nothing and changed the frontier town forever. Before we begin, comment your country so I know where the story is reaching. Snow softened every edge of the town when Iris Calloway stepped down from the stagecoach. The day held a pale, steady light that made the world seem like a photograph left to cool, quiet, luminous, and unforgiving. Her satchel was small, tied tight with the same thread she had used to tie the loose ends of her life. She had imagined other arrivals, laughter, a man on the porch with his hat in hand, neighbors leaning out of windows with questions that felt like invitations. None of that waited for her. What waited was a road with the imprint of wheels and a wind that moved through the town like a slow, disapproving breath. She walked with her chin level and her hands steady. That steadiness was learned. The things she carried inside were not visible. The word virgin on the page of a marriage contract and the rusty, cautious hope that it might mean safety rather than shame. She had left behind a place that measured people in debts and favors. She had been traded in whispers and calculations. She had learned how to hold her name as if it were something fragile and precious. The innkeeper met her first. He had a kind, tired face and the practical kindness of people who had survived winters too many. He offered her a corner by the stove and a mug that still smelled faintly of bread, then smelled of hot metal and boiling coffee and damp wool, smells that promised temporary shelter and nothing more. She accepted the warmth without apology. Outside, the wind painted the windows with drifting white. Night blurred into small hours. The town slowed the way a body slows before sleep. Iris sat with both hands around her mug, thinking of the letter and the name Jonas Estelle, the man who had ordered a wife by mail and written in careful lines about wanting help with his mother and the garden and the long house that had grown too quiet after hard years. His words had been practical and oddly respectful for someone who had made a bargain of loneliness. He had written of routine and small duties, of a life that would require early mornings and steady hands. He had not written about laughter or whether he still remembered how to speak to a stranger. When he finally came in, he stood in the doorway for a long moment, shoulders lined with the cold of the road. He was older than the letter suggested, more worn, less theatrical in his sorrow than the string of polite sentences that had escorted her across state lines. His eyes were the color of water after ice, clear and quick to look away. He introduced himself without flourish and apologized for the delay in a voice that did not demand forgiveness but offered it anyway. He spoke like a man who had practiced small courtesies because the rest of his life had been practiced in restraint. They rode the next morning in a wagon that smelled of oil and livestock. The road rose in brittle breasts and fell into low, white hollows where the fence lines disappeared under drifts. Iris watched the plains unfold, a paper world of prairies and shallow gullies. Jonas kept his hands quiet on the reins. He spoke when it mattered. Which way to the pasture, which willows bent in winter, how the wind had shifted in the last week, and what that meant for cattle. He spoke in the measured, exact language of people who build their days from tasks. He did not speak of the woman, who had once sat in the voice that now measured the wagon's pace. The farmhouse lifted out of the snow, like something that had been sleeping and had just woken. It stood too big for a single body, too hollow at the edges. Along the porch, a coat hung like a hollow presence. A woman's shawl, thin, frayed, hung from a peg and seemed to keep its own memory of hands that had warmed it once. Jonas opened the door and called softly to people she had not met yet. 2 children with cautious eyes and a grandmother who moved like someone carrying the last of a long patience. They watched her arrive, more measurement than curiosity in their faces. The smallest child clutched a rag doll, the way people clutch things that make a house feel less empty. The older child kept his hands busy with chores and his head down. The grandmother looked her over with a few quick, assessing looks that were neither kind nor cruel, only practical. This family had learned to weigh everything by its usefulness and its burden. Iris felt both categories, stacked against her like winter would at a door. The first days were practical, ordinary in the way they squeezed a life of routine out of any grand thought. Fetch water, mend linens, learn to read the weather in the feathered clouds and in the cattle's restlessness. She fell into tasks the way someone falls into the steps of a dance they have watched from the edge of the floor. She was careful with the children's questions. She answered without story, with the kind of short, truthful sentences that teach respect rather than plead for love. It was not love she expected to find. She had been young when men first took interest in her, and she had learned that desire could feel like ownership. She had learned how easily being called a bride could mean being given away. Lips on paper and signatures could be the most efficient kind of imprisonment. She had arrived ready to work, to be useful, and to be seen as something more than a price. Jonas watched her from the edges of evenings, hands often folded, jaws set as if bracing against some old ache. He did not speak of grief, but his silence had the shape of someone who had once owned a bright, patient laughter and had watched it leave the house and never return. He did not know how to be a lover or a friend because the house had taught him to be a keeper and a feeder of needs. Slowly, cautious as thawing ground, he began to unlearn the way loneliness had taught him to hold his days. The children were the unexpected work. The older boy, Thomas, was quick with tasks and slow with words, a boy who had learned to be a man by doing the work of one. The little girl, May, slipped against Iris like a small shadow that preferred warmth. Iris did not force affection. She offered steadiness. Porridge at the same hour, a dry bandage wrapped right, a hand at the small, startled places where childhood still bled. On a late afternoon when the light was the color of old paper, Iris found a torn scrap of cloth folded on the pantry shelf. It was marked with a neat, childish drawing of a horse and a sun. She pinned it with the crooked pins of someone who was learning how to make small acts of kindness into habits. The grandmother, who had not smiled in many winters, later placed a cup of tea by Iris's plate and said, in a voice that had forgotten how to soften, "You have hands that know how to keep a house from falling apart." It was the smallest compliment, but in a household that had been learning the language of survival, it felt like a benediction. There were blemishes. The town had its opinions, and people were quick to adjust a face that gave them comfort. Some men lingered too long in remarks about girls and virtue. Some neighbors assumed a mail-order bride meant a bargain. Iris learned to move through those looks like the headwind that the plains offered, steady and forward, never stopping. Winter made its own demands. One week the temperature dropped and the pipes froze and the hens hatched in the dark, and then not at all. The stove required more wood than usual. The work tightened like a rope around everyone's shoulders. It revealed small fractures and small mercies. In those days, when the house felt most fragile, something shifted in the way Jonas watched Iris move through the rooms. He noticed the way she hummed to herself while kneading bread, the way her fingers located a loose seam without being asked, the way she soothed a child who could not sleep by passing a hand over her forehead, as if she could smooth out the sky itself. On a night when the wind was so hard the shutters rattled, May woke screaming with a fever that seemed to climb and refuse to descend. Iris sat up, the steady figure in a white night, and tended the child with simple, careful ministrations. She washed cloths, warmed broth, held the small body as if it were a bird and not a child. Jonas sat in the doorway, his face a map of a man who had been taught to bear losses as if they were inevitable. He did not crowd, but he did not leave either. When the fever finally broke, the relief in the house was a loud thing that lingered like the scent of rain after a drought. It was in that exhaustion, in the hum of quiet after a long night, that an unspoken thing took hold. Jonas, who had learned to measure his days with ledger lines and fences, began to count other things. May's light laugh as she ate porridge, the way Thomas set the table with small pride, the way Iris had mended the old shawl and returned it to its peg, the shawl that might once have belonged to someone they had loved and lost. He had not promised love when he wrote the letter. He had asked for help. Love arrived anyway, shaped quietly by the work of living together. For Iris, the house stopped feeling like a place where she might be traded again. The way they acknowledged her, sometimes with practical nod, sometimes with a look that held more gratitude than words, was different than the transaction she had known. It was not loud or dramatic. It was a steady, unassuming sort of thing that, over weeks and months, reconstructed a life. She still kept to her small satchel at night, the one that held her few personal things, the papers that said who she had been and who she might be. But she began to place a small folded cloth inside it, a keepsake of the children's art, a scrap of thread from the shawl, a feather from a bird May had named. Day by day, the satchel's contents changed from necessities into memory. When the first thaw loosened the edge of winter and the river began to move again, Iris walked the ridge beyond the barn with Thomas and May. They found new shoots pushing through last year's brittle grasses. She knelt and pointed them out, showing the children how to see that life persisted even under the weight of a hard season. Thomas watched her with a look that was almost like admiration. May reached for her hand without hesitation. Jonah stood back and watched them, the way someone watches a new field learn to be a field. He had not planned for this. He had written letters about chores, not about houses full of laughter. But in the quiet intervals between work and sleep, he found himself making small changes. A repaired fence left standing a foot straighter, a table polished more often, a bowl left empty of porridge one morning so Iris could rest a little longer. The house began to breathe differently. It kept warm in a way that had nothing to do with coal and firewood and everything to do with the exchange of small attentions. In the slow rhythm of days that winter had taught them, something like trust took root. It would not be called love in a day or even a month. It grew in increments, in the way Jonah stopped looking away when Iris spoke, in the way Iris began to fold his shirts and leave them in a stack he could find without thinking, in the way the children chattered at supper, as if they had always known this life. The virgin bride had arrived with nothing more than a satchel and a signature. She would not leave as nothing. She would change the house by being present, by being patient, and by listening for the small, stubborn promises that people often forgot they had capacity to make. The land did not hurry her. The winter had taught them all that some things only change in their own seasons. The first true spring wind came slow across the prairie, brushing the tops of grass like a hand smoothing down a restless child. It carried the smell of damp soil and thawed bark, and for the first time since Iris arrived, the land felt awake. The snow retreated into thin ribbons along fence posts, leaving behind soft earth that clung to boots and reminded everyone that life could return after long silence. Jonah spent most mornings repairing what winter had punished. Hinges, roof shingles, trough boards, the corral gate. One by one they gave up their secrets and flaws beneath his patient hands. Iris worked beside him when she could, kneeling in the mud with a calm steadiness that surprised him. He wasn't used to a woman willing to help with outdoor chores. He wasn't used to anyone beside him at all. There was an unspoken rhythm forming, a shared pace that didn't require conversation to make sense. Inside the house, the children shed the stiffness winter had carved into them. Thomas helped with the chickens, shoulders less guarded now that Iris no longer felt like a stranger. May followed Iris room to room, her small fingers always reaching for a hem or sleeve, as if touch could reassure her that this new woman would not vanish without warning. The grandmother, Mrs. Estelle, softened too, though her softness came in tiny signs. A bowl placed at Iris's seat before she could reach for one, a mended apron left folded in the bed, a faint nod of approval when Iris hung the wash with even spacing. Still, beneath the daily tasks and shared silences, a deeper tension lingered, quiet, persistent, patient. Jonas carried it the way men carry injuries that never quite healed. He worked hard, spoke little, and whenever their hands brushed or their eyes met longer than necessary, he looked away first. It was not rejection. It was caution, as if he feared letting his heart make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. One afternoon, while Iris gathered laundry from the line, Mrs. Estelle joined her with a slow, heavy step. The older woman's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the years. "You do the work well," she said without preamble. "Better than most could, coming into a house they weren't born to." Iris nodded, folding a sheet. "I do what I can." Mrs. Estelle studied her a moment, eyes sharp beneath their clouded softness. "Jonas isn't an easy man. Loss carved him deep. It made him careful, made him quiet. But don't mistake that for coldness." "I don't," Iris answered quietly. "Good." The older woman paused, as if weighing whether to speak the next truth. "What he needs isn't noise. It's steadiness. And you have that." She reached out, touched Iris's wrist, a rare gesture. "If you choose to stay." Iris held the warm sheet against her chest. "I haven't thought about leaving." Mrs. Estelle gave a small, knowing smile. "You will someday." Everyone thinks about it. What matters is what tethers you. The conversation stayed with Iris long after the sheets were folded. She hadn't come seeking a tether. She had come seeking safety. But the house was slowly teaching her new shapes of belonging, shapes she didn't yet know how to name. Days lengthened. Iris learned the sound of Jonas's footsteps, the way he always paused at the back door before entering, as if remembering to adjust himself to the world inside. He learned the way she hummed softly in the evenings, unconsciously matching the rhythm of the rocking chair. Thomas began asking her questions about recipes and animals. May slept tucked against Iris every afternoon without fear. Still, Jonas's grief hovered, a thin shadow that stretched into every room. It changed the day Iris found the old wooden box. She had been dusting the top shelf of the wardrobe, while Jonas tended to the livestock. The box was small, carved by hand, its edges worn smooth from years of fingers passing over it. She opened it only because the lid shifted when she touched it. Inside lay a handful of belongings: a pressed flower, a torn ribbon, a small ivory comb, and a letter that had faded into soft brown tones. Iris didn't read the letter. She didn't need to. Anyone who has lived through loss knows the shape of it, without seeing the words. She closed the box gently and placed it back where she found it. When Jonas came inside later, tired and smelling of sun and field dust, she expected him to ask if she had touched the box. He didn't. He walked past her with the same cautious nod and washed his hands at the basin. But that night, as they sat at opposite ends of the long table, he spoke. "That box belonged to Clara," he said quietly. Iris set down her fork. "I didn't open it." He gave a slow breath. "You could have. I wouldn't have blamed you. People are curious about ghosts, even when they don't mean to be. I don't want to disturb what isn't mine." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her through a different lens entirely. "Nothing in this house was meant to burden you," he said. "Not my past. Not my grief. Not the mistakes that made me send for someone I had no right to ask anything of." "You asked for someone willing to work," she answered softly. "You didn't lie." He shook his head. "I should have asked for someone I could learn to trust again. Someone patient enough to let me try." A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, only full. The next morning, Jonas saddled the horse and asked her to ride with him. They took the trail behind the ridge, the one that wound to the cottonwoods, and followed a thin stream that glittered with hints of thaw. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence beside her was its own kind of confession. They reached a clearing she hadn't seen before, a place where the grass bent gently with the wind, and the sky stretched wide and empty. Here, the world looked unhurried, content to simply be. "This is where I used to come," Jonas said, hands loose on the reins, "when the house felt too small for grief. When I couldn't breathe in those rooms without feeling like I was taking someone else's air." Iris listened. "I don't want that anymore," he continued. "I don't want a house full of ghosts. I want a house full of life. And you—" His voice trailed off as if afraid to finish the sentence. She didn't push him. He wasn't a man who could be pushed. They rode back in a quiet that felt different now. Not tense, not fragile, just open. Days folded into one another. Jonas began leaving small signs of his shifting heart. A repaired drawer she had been struggling with, a chair set closer to hers by the fire, an extra piece of bread placed at her plate. He spoke her name more often. He asked her opinions on ranch matters. He let the children climb onto her lap without hesitation. But the moment she noticed a change most was when the grandmother fell ill. A spring cold, mild at first, then stubborn, then worrying. Iris tended to her, sitting at her bedside in long stretches, wiping her brow, helping her sip broth and warm water. Jonas lingered nearby, unsure whether to intervene or trust Iris's care. Thomas and May hovered in the doorway each night. It was on the fourth evening, when Mrs. Estelle regained enough strength to speak, that she whispered the words that broke something gently open. "You've given this house its breath back," she murmured. "Stay with them. Stay with him." Iris squeezed the older woman's hand. "I'm not planning to leave." "You might not plan it," Mrs. Estelle whispered, "but life has a way of testing what we claim. Remember what you've made here. Hold it." The next morning, Her fever receded. On the porch steps, while Jonas chopped wood, Iris watched him with a quiet clarity. He paused, sensing her gaze, and for the first time he didn't look away. He walked to her slowly, brushing sawdust from his hands. "You become the spine of this house," he said. "And I don't know how to say thank you without saying everything else that sits behind it." She felt her breath tighten. "You don't owe me thanks." "No," he said, "but I owe you honesty." He sat beside her, elbows on his knees, staring out at the fields. "You don't know what it means to me that you're here. You came with nothing. You owed us nothing. But you changed us anyway." Iris folded her hands. "Maybe we all needed changing." "I did," he admitted. It wasn't a confession of love. It wasn't dramatic. It was real, and it was enough to shift the ground beneath them. That night, as the children slept and the house settled into the creaks and sighs of a long day, Jonas lingered at her door before retreating to his room. She sensed he was waiting for courage, and she sensed he would find it in time. But spring was not finished testing them. 2 days later, a rider from the neighboring ranch arrived with news. Flash flood near the west pasture. Jonas's herd had scattered in the storm, and several cattle were missing. He left before dawn to search. When he didn't return by sunset, Iris felt a familiar, cold memory of abandonment rise in her chest. But she pushed it down and kept the lanterns lit. She paced the porch until her feet ached. He returned after midnight, soaked, shivering, but alive. She helped him inside, pulled off his wet coat, pressed a warm cloth to his face. He didn't speak at first. He simply reached for her hand, fingers trembling from cold and something deeper. "I kept thinking," he whispered, voice raw, "that if something happened to me out there, I'd never get to tell you what I've been holding in my chest." Her heart thudded once, heavy and clear, then "Tell me now." Jonas's breath shivered as if he had never spoken such words aloud. "Iris, I don't want this house or my life without you in it." She felt the truth settle deep, steady, warm. Spring had arrived, and with it, a new season she hadn't dared imagine. The seasons turned with a patience that belonged only to the prairie. Spring settled into early summer, warm and wide, drawing long shadows across the ranch and softened the edges of every hardship the family had carried. Days stretched slow, nights breath quiet, and Iris felt, for the first time in her life, that she was not surviving someone else's story. She was living her own. Jonas kept close without crowding her. He worked the fields with steadier rhythm now, as if the weight in his chest had eased and made room for something gentler. The children followed Iris everywhere with a loyalty earned, not claimed. Thomas carried himself taller. May clung to her hand, not from fear, but from comfort. Even the grandmother, though still stern, no longer watched Iris out of suspicion. Instead, she watched the way one watches the first steady fire after a long winter. Quietly, gratefully. Life settled into a pattern that felt like a beginning rather than recovery. But the prairie had a way of testing those beginnings. It happened on a hot afternoon in mid-June. The air was heavy, the kind that made shirts cling and breaths drag. Jonas had taken Thomas to clear brush near the south pasture. Iris stayed behind with May, teaching her how to braid scraps of cloth into small ropes for dolls. The grandmother rested in her rocker, drifting in and out of sleep. Then thunder rolled in the distance. It wasn't a sharp storm cloud thunder. It was a long, low tremor that made the windows rattle. Iris stood, heart thudding once and hard. May whispered, "What is that?" Another rumble shook the ground. Not thunder. Hooves. A stampede. Iris rushed to the porch. A dark wave of dust rose near the pasture, thick and rolling like boiling smoke. The cattle had broken their line, frightened by something she couldn't see. And Jonas, he was somewhere in that moving chaos. Fear hit her stomach like falling weight. She didn't shout. Fear never made a sound in her life. It only made decisions. She told May to stay with her grandmother. Then she grabbed a small lantern, even though the sun still burned high, and ran toward the pasture. Her skirt tangled around her legs, but she kept running, breath sharp, lungs scraping dry air. Halfway across the field, she saw Jonas. He wasn't hurt, but Thomas had slipped while climbing a low ridge to escape the stampede. The boy sat against a rock, leg twisted at an angle that forced a cry from his throat every time he tried to shift. Jonas knelt beside him, hands steady but face strained with helplessness. When he saw Iris, something moved in his expression, relief, fear, and a depth of trust that couldn't be mistaken. "I'm here," Iris said, voice calm despite the pounding in her ribs. "Tell me what you need." Jonas exhaled like a man handing over the weight of a whole winter. "We can't move him alone," he said, "and the cattle will circle back. Then we will lift him together." She tied her skirt higher, wrapped her hands beneath the boy's arms, and nodded to Jonas. With one slow pull, they lifted Thomas just enough to shift him onto Jonas's back. The boy whimpered, clinging to his father's shirt. "We'll get you home," Iris whispered. "Hold on to him. You're safe." The walk back felt longer than any mile she had ever known. Dust clung to their throats. The distant rumble of hooves rose and fell like a living threat. Jonas carried Thomas with strength that came from fear and love braided tightly together. When they reached the porch, Iris guided them inside. She sent May for cloth and water. She steadied the grandmother when she rose too, quickly. She knelt beside Thomas with gentle hands and spoke to him the way people speak when they refuse to let fear grow roots. The doctor arrived hours later. He set the bone, wrapped it, and declared Thomas lucky to be alive. But the moment the doctor left, Jonas stepped out onto the porch alone. Iris followed after, not to comfort him, but because she felt drawn by something unspoken. He stood facing the open land, shoulders tense, breath uneven. "He could have died," Jonas said quietly. "My boy, he could have died while I stood 3 feet from him." "You saved him," Iris replied. "I didn't," he said, shaking his head. "You did. You came running. You didn't freeze. You carried him with me. You kept this house steady through every sickness and storm." He turned toward her, eyes fierce with something she had not seen in them before. "Iris, I've spent years fearing I would fail the people I love, that I would lose them like I lost Clara. But you," his voice broke, not from weakness, but from truth finally rising. "You've given this family more than I ever asked for, more than I deserve." Iris felt a warmth spread through her, quiet but strong. "I didn't come here to be owed anything. I came here because the world I left behind had nothing left for me. And somehow this place grew into something I didn't expect." Jonas stepped closer. "I don't know how to say this in a grand way. I don't have that kind of poetry. But I'll say it plain. I love you, not out of loneliness, not because I needed someone, but because somewhere between winter and now, my life grew around you." She inhaled slowly, the air warm against her lips. "Jonas, I care for you too, deeply, more than I ever thought possible." He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Their fingers met like two halves of a bridge that had taken months to build, board by board, moment by moment. Inside the house, Thomas stirred and called for her. She squeezed Jonas's hand once and whispered, "Let's go to our family." And he followed her inside, not as a man ashamed of his past, but as one ready to build whatever future she would share. Weeks passed. Thomas healed. May grew bolder. The grandmother regained her strength. And one warm evening, with lantern light spilling across the porch and the scent of watered earth drifting through the windows, Jonas asked Iris to marry him properly. Not by paper, not by contract, but by choice. "I want you beside me," he said. "Not because duty brought you here, but because love keeps you." She said yes. The wedding was simple. A few neighbors, a short prayer, a promise spoken with steady voices. Iris wore a dress she had sewn herself, hands trembling only once as she tied the final ribbon. Jonas stood tall beside her, looking at her the way men look when they believe the world has finally given them mercy. When he kissed her, the wind carried out over the fields like a quiet blessing. The virgin bride who had arrived with nothing left of ceremony with a home, a family, and a life reshaped entirely by courage and kindness. The prairie no longer felt empty. It felt like hers. It felt like they belonged to it together. And for years to come, whenever people spoke of Iris Estelle, they spoke of the woman who walked into a stranger's life and turned it into a story worth remembering, slowly, gently, steadfastly. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more Wild West love stories. Your support helps these frontier tales reach even more people.